It was only a few weeks ago that the Democratic presidential primary field was still shrinking. But with less than 3 months until the first votes are cast, another new entrant has joined the already crowded field. Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg made his entry into the 2020 contest official yesterday. The 77-year-old billionaire has vowed to self-fund his campaign, and he's kicked off his campaign with a $37 million ad buy. For context, that is more money than the campaigns of Elizabeth Warren, Pete Buttigieg, or Joe Biden have spent on the entire primary race so far as of last month's filing deadline, and barely less than the entire amount already spent by Bernie Sanders, again, just on one ad buy. Bloomberg's progressive opponents have already taken aim at his lavish spending.
We do not believe that billionaires have the right to buy elections. Multi-billionaires like Mr. Bloomberg are not going to get very far in this election.
Michael Bloomberg is making a bet about democracy in 2020. He doesn't need people. He only needs bags and bags of money.
Charlie Cook is the editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report and a columnist for National Journal. He's an NBC News political analyst. Charlie, how does this change the race?
You know, it's funny. It's easy to be dismissive of Bloomberg, that he's got problems in the African-American community because of stop and frisk. He's a billionaire businessman at a time when the party's going in a progressive direction. But it's funny. You could go through every single one of the credible Democratic candidates and come up with good reasons why each one of them can't win the nomination. But every single one of them is going to. But the fact that he doesn't have to spend time on Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina, that he could be spending spending his ad buy on 24 states at once. Worried about 56 other states or 46 other states rather than just those four. It's really interesting to see that it could be like a whole new paradigm, kind of like Trump being able to run last time with spending less money.
Because the current paradigm is that unless you come in first, second, or third in Iowa, you are not a contender.
Exactly. But that's all about momentum. The first four states are about momentum, and then the last 46 are about delegates, because there aren't that many delegates in the first four states. Bloomberg, he can concentrate on delegates from the get-go. So it's interesting. I'm a little skeptical, but he may have a whole different set of rules than every other Democrat has to run with.
You've based this on the math that you've run on delegates and how this works. And if this race continues to be as competitive as it is, and somebody doesn't get a majority of the first round of delegates, the whole situation at the convention changes, because a second vote includes a whole lot more delegates. All of those super delegates that are excluded from the first round then come in. So if somebody doesn't get a majority of the 1,600 or so delegates on the first ballot, a contested convention, unusual though it is, could be the kind of thing that Bloomberg could be looking at.
Exactly. 70% of the delegates are going to be picked by the end of March, so that if you don't have someone with anywhere near a majority at that point, and there are only 25% of the pledged delegates left from there till June, then you probably aren't going to have anybody anywhere near a majority going into the convention. But I would just never use the term brokered convention, because we don't have brokers in American politics anymore. But contested convention, that's a real possibility.
You wrote something interesting in your column that I believe is just published. You said, notice these arguments, if all taken equal, these are the arguments against the existing contenders, if all taken equally seriously, effectively eliminate every credible Democratic contender. But profundity alert, someone has to win the Democratic nomination. You're right, logically, but the point that Michael Bloomberg is trying to make, and he made it today, actually, when someone said, are you saying that no one else can beat Donald Trump? Listen to it in his words.
Some are saying that they see your decision to run now as an indication that you feel that the current candidates in the field are weak and they can't get the job done. Is that accurate?
Well, let me phrase it this way. I think that there is a greater risk of having Donald Trump reelected than there was before. And in the end, I looked in the mirror and said that just cannot let this happen.
There's a weird flavor to the way he talks about himself, but but he's making a point that he actually doesn't think the others can win and he can beat Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, I mean, exactly. The thing about it is, what I disagree with the question that was asked of him was, I think he's afraid that Elizabeth Warren will win the nomination and can't beat President Trump, and that he has no confidence or very little confidence that Vice President Biden can. I think if Biden were doing better or Warren was doing worse, then I don't think Bloomberg would be in this race. I mean, and if he just wanted to stop Warren, he could just he could just pay for a super PAC to stop her. But I think he sees an opening here.
You think about this a lot. Do you share his view that any of the other candidates in there are not as likely to beat Donald Trump?
I think some candidates are more likely than others. Look, if this is a referendum up or down on President Trump, I think he loses that. The question is it going to be a referendum on something else or someone else? And if Democrats nominate just someone that's not as polarizing as President Trump is, they will win that election. The question is, what is the risk tolerance for Democrats in this race? How much do they want to risk? How far out there do they want to go and run the risk of reelecting him?
Charlie, good to see you. Thank you for your analysis tonight.
Thanks,
Charlie Cook.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.